morning and welcome to Religious Studies Asks. This is a segment where I interview faculty in religious studies about their interests and their studies in order to familiarize students and the general community about what religious studies is, especially here at Penn State. So thank you so much for joining me today. To begin, do you mind introducing yourself and providing us with a brief overview of your academic background, the classes you teach, and your research interests within the field of religious studies?
Sure, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. This is a real treat, and I'm always happy to talk about my research and religious studies here at Penn State. So my name is Amara Solari. I am a professor of art history and anthropology, trained as an art historian. My area of research is Latin America generally, and then more specifically, I work on indigenous Spanish interaction in the early colonial period. So more or less about 1500 to 1700. And my research is specifically interested in figuring out how indigenous peoples used art and architecture as a form of active resistance against colonizing missions, so against forced evangelism to Catholicism. So in that regard, the classes I teach at Penn State are all have to do with this kind of time period and also the pre-Columbian time period. So my actual training is in the pre-Columbian time period. So I teach classes on the Mayas, the Aztecs, the Inca, all these fantastic civilizations that predate European contact. And then I also teach classes on colonial interaction, so specifically between Europeans and indigenous people coming into contact in the early colonial period and what that looked like.
Great, thank you. That's super interesting. And already I can kind of see hints of religious turmoil. But before we really get into that, I'm just curious about how you began to study what you study. Like, when did this interest peak for you? How did you get to here at Penn State?
Great question. I know, and everybody's journey to this is a little bit different, obviously. Mine started as a child. I was kind of a dorky kid, and my first introduction to Latin America and to pre-Columbian societies was actually a family vacation when I was younger. And I guess that really stuck with me because when I got to college, like a lot of undergrads, I thought I was going to be a doctor, and I started with pre-med, and then I was like, this is boring. And I took an archaeology class as a GE requirement, and I was like, wait a minute, people do this like for their real lives? That's amazing. Coming into college, a lot of us don't understand how many careers there actually are in the world. And so, and then I fell in love with art history, had to take art history for the same reason, just a GE class. And then I figured out I can marry those two disciplines if I studied pre-Columbian and early colonial Mexico and Latin America more generally. And so it was a way to kind of wed my disciplinary interests. And thankfully, I was in a university that kind of fostered those kinds of conversations. And even at an early age, like in my undergraduate, I was participating in archaeological excavations in Honduras to begin with. I decided pretty early on that archaeology, like dirt archaeology, I'm not like tough enough for it. and archival work and museum work was a little bit more my speed. And so for graduate school, art history seemed like the better choice rather than archaeology.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I've heard so many similar stories of professors starting off in like a STEM related field and then made the switch. So that's always cool to hear another one.
Yeah, because you just don't know that you can study something like religious studies. Like that doesn't come up like in high school career counseling. Oh, by the way, you can do this thing. And so, we call, I know now on the other side as a professor, we call these like discovery majors, right? Art history, religious studies, CAMs, any of those. Most students don't start knowing that they want to study those things. You have to kind of like be exposed to them, usually in a GE class, right? So that's why personally, I love teaching. I teach one humongous pre-Columbian art history class. And, it's like 150, 200 kids. It depends on the semester. And I love it because, you just see students' eyes like just open up for the first time. Like, wow, it's like a whole world I didn't know about. And if you're lucky, a couple of them maybe end up majoring, but maybe minoring or just taking a couple other classes with me or with my colleagues. And I'm, from a role of a teacher or a professor, like that's my job, like to kind of
Hmm.
incite this interest in students for this wider
Right.
world, right? We're not just little central Pennsylvania. There's this whole world
Yeah.
out there.
Hmm. So, since we're on the topic, I want to ask any advice you might have if there is someone who thinks this is really interesting, maybe wants to major in it, but is worried about, what the future might look like in a career like this.
Sure.
What would you say to them?
I would say, as somebody who obviously made a similar choice, I would say just follow your passions, because I know it's harder for this generation to get jobs in the humanities, the social sciences, or professorships, or get into grad school. But I really feel like a life is fulfilled when you wake up excited to do your job every day. And if
Mhm.
there's any possible way you can figure out how to make that happen for yourself, that's a good life.
Mhm.
That's where people describe happiness, right? Where they go to work and they don't feel like it's work with I guess, a capital W, right?
Yeah.
Um, and at Penn State, we're so lucky in that it's a massive community, right? And so there are so many professors studying so many different things, people giving so many talks and so many classes and so many workshops, that it provides a kind of venue for students to do exploration that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do in a smaller college or university, right? So that
Mhm.
the sheer size of Penn State is really one of its primary assets, I think, in this regard.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really valuable. Okay, so we mentioned the word interdisciplinary. Can
Mhm.
you talk about how this word impacted your studies and what it means to you, I guess?
Yeah, because it's kind of a buzzword right now, and we're being, prompted by the higher ups at the university to engage in interdisciplinary research and blah blah blah. I think, in my own discipline, field, and subfield, you cannot study an ancient culture without being interdisciplinary. You just can't. There's no way. You have to be versant in archaeological methods, anthropological methods, art historical methods, linguistic methods. And so just by the very nature of kind of the questions we're asking, we need a very unique kind of skill set. And you're only going to get that unique skill set by studying specifically in distinct and siloed disciplines, right? So, and it's from my perspective, it's an ethical issue as well, because we're trying to do responsible research for human beings who no longer speak for themselves. And in some cases, weren't allowed to speak for themselves even in their own time periods. In my time period, in particular, right, in a kind of colonized moment, indigenous peoples didn't have a kind of voice. And so, as a historian looking backwards, it's my responsibility to do ethical due diligence. And sorry, that's my bunny jumping around making noise. um, and ethical due diligence means acquiring that vast and broad skill set, just to make sure you know the right kinds of questions to ask, you know how to answer those questions. So for all of those reasons, for me, it's necessary to do good, valid research, but it has this ethical component as well.
Mhm. Okay. So, as an art historian, how do you study religion, like through art? Or how does religion get factored into your research?
Sure, that's a great question. So the artworks I study are housed in religious contexts. Okay, so I primarily study artworks that are, right now my interest is mural painting, right? So murals that appear on the interior and sometimes exterior walls of mission churches that were built as part of this evangelical campaign. So I study not just the iconography of the murals. And as you can imagine, it's all very Catholic, Christian, Jesus, Mary, saints, Francis, you know, the kind of usual cast of characters. I study the iconography. And I also study how those murals were produced, so the techniques of their production, because in many indigenous and Amerindian communities, the ingredients and the pigments that were used to display particular iconographic motifs carried religious symbolism and meaning with them. So it's not just what's imaged, it's how it's imaged, like what the actual materials of the paint itself. So I kind of look at artwork as an avenue through which indigenous peoples interpret new religious concepts through their own native lenses, right? So that it's not, it might look purely European. Maybe you're looking at a scene of the crucifixion, but until you really kind of drill down into the pigments that are being used, you cannot understand how an indigenous person would have approached this religion, that story, this theology, the whole ritual and liturgical kind of armature that goes along with these practices. You have to understand the whole complex scenario of those artworks making.
Okay. So if I might be wrong, but so you're saying that indigenous people produced art directly responding to like the Christians, the Catholics who were coming in with their own religion.
Yeah.
Can you give an example of like what that might
Sure.
look like?
Yeah, the most obvious one I can point to is one that I've written about and talked about a lot, and that's the indigenous artist employment of a pigment called Maya blue. And Maya blue is this vibrant turquoise color. It's really kind of a magical pigment. Blues historically are hard to produce and they're hard to maintain. They fade really quickly. This one does not. It has magical chemical properties that allows it to be steadfast through hundreds of years. And so when indigenous peoples are tasked with painting iconographically complex and pretty standardized images in terms of orthodoxy and post-Tridentine moments, right after the Council of Trent, they select this pigment, among others, to image very important icons of Christianity. So, for example, Christ's crown of thorns is always painted using Maya blue. Now, on the surface, this just looks like an aesthetic choice, right? Oh, they like blue. Awesome. In fact, that pigment has about 1,000-year history in the region as being tied specifically to concepts of ritual fixity and of sacrifice, all kinds of sacrifice, just basic like giving of things to the deities to keep the cosmos in order. So by using that particular pigment, they're basically coding or encoding, I guess is a better word for it, encoding this Christian theology within an extant pre-Columbian religious ideology.
Okay, that's interesting. So for my last question, I want to hear more about your recent research. Any books you've written, any papers, projects? Just tell us a little bit about what you're doing right now.
Sure. So I'm in the middle of a career change in terms of field. So all of my training and I have 3 monographs written on some of the things I've just described, all based in the Yucatan Peninsula and that center on the Maya population, right, of the Yucatan Peninsula. I am embarking on a huge new project that is centered on the New Mexican mission. So the mission system that was established and attempted to evangelize the Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest. So these are missions that are largely along the Rio Grande and kind of outside of Santa Fe and Albuquerque, New Mexico. So this is a much more difficult project because all of the churches that I'm studying are no longer extant. They were all destroyed either previous to or in the Pueblo Revolt, which was it's a very famous indigenous revolt that took place in 1680. And so I'm dealing with, it's kind of hard, an art history of artworks that are no longer extant. It's challenging, but it's really exciting. I just was awarded 2 large fellowships to work on this book project. So I'm at this kind of mid-career exciting moment where, I don't know, I needed a change. And I've always been totally fascinated by the Southwest and Pueblo culture. So this seemed like a good kind of next project.
Yeah, that is so exciting. Congratulations on the fellowships.
Thank
And
you. Thank you.
yes, it's a very, yeah, I'm interested to see what comes out of it. Well, thank you so much for letting me interview you today.
You're so welcome. This is lovely.
Yeah, it's so nice to get an art historian on here. You're the first.
Okay.
So thank you for representing, and yeah, thank you so much.
You are so welcome. You have a lovely day.